Shalom. Today we will start exploring the fascinating world of Midrash. Midrash is a unique body of literature that was created firstly in the Tana'im period during the writing of the Mishnah, and later compiled and expanded during the Amoraic period during the writing of the Talmud. There is additional Midrashic literature that was created far later during the early Middle Ages that holds somewhat of a different character. Midrashic literature holds tremendous importance in the world of Jewish literature. It is unique because it is written in a very different style. It is not your typical style that has the structure of the halachic system. It is not methodological like most of the Talmud. It is written in somewhat of a free style, a creative style. It has multiple writers, each taking poetic license to try to express ideas, thoughts, morality, but usually through stories, parables, or general ideas, often taking typical biblical stories and inserting ideas into them or additions to try to expand our horizons in thinking about the biblical story. Thus, Midrashic literature has to be taken and studied very carefully. Most of it is not intended to be taken quite literally. Indeed, some are written as what we would call fill in the blanks. Too often we read a biblical story and we might come across a story that says, wait a minute, what happened in between? Or what happened in all the missing years? Or what happened in the interaction between those two people before the biblical story started? Often the Midrash is designed to try to fill that in, sometimes through tradition, various traditions that were passed on from generation to generation until the given rabbi decided to write it down. And other times they are reflective of the creative understanding of the author himself. It is important to note that there is some Midrashic literature from the early time period, early Tanaic period, that has a very different category. They are defined as what we would call Midrashei Halacha. In fact, because they were written in the Tanaic period, they hold within them specifics of Jewish law. These specifics do affect the way the halachic system functions and give us much important information about the halachic structure. But the type of midrashim that we will be using in these discussions are quite different. I would be deliberately pulling from midrashim that on the surface seems to be somewhat unusual, creative to the degree of ludicrous. Sometimes an expression in Midrash could sound so strange that we would just shrug our shoulders and say, all right, let's move on. But with careful analysis, with careful reading, perhaps together we could come up with new ideas, a new understanding that would lead us to better understand biblical messages, better understand teachings that our sages wanted us to derive through the morality that stands behind these ideas and stories. They're not always easy to grasp. And oftentimes when you scan through Midrashic literature, you will find yourself bewildered, lost. And sometimes it is simply impossible to understand what the particular Midrash was designed to tell us because it was said specifically for a time and place in which it was said, and perhaps we've lost the gift of being able to uncover what its true nature means. But for the most part, if we invest the time and depth of thought, we would find a very rich and beautiful world that is designed to allow us to think, to reflect, and perhaps hone in our sense of morality and guide us through a better way of living our lives. I would like to start with a particular example, a fairly peculiar example, about a biblical personality that in the Bible itself only appears towards the end of the storyline. He's only explicitly mentioned in the end of the life of Moshe, at the end of the journey through the desert after 40 years, and he's mentioned simply as a king of a powerful nation. This man is named by the name of Og. Og, the king of Bashan. Og, the king of Bashan, is merely on the surface another king of another nation, one of the Amorite nations, that confronts the Israelites as they are a young nation, courageous nation, trying to forge its way right before it is ready to enter into the land of Israel and conquer it. It is the second major battle that Am Yisrael will have to fight. They've had other skirmishes. The first major battle was against the king of Sichon. This next battle against the king of Og prompts a curious message from God to Moshe. Moshe is told by God, right before this great battle, do not revere him, because I will give him in your hands today. Al tirauto, do not revere him, ask the sages. Why would Moses need to have a particular warning given in this particular battle? And immediately, the Midrash, as quoted in the Tractate of Brachot in the 9th chapter, tells us a fascinating and bizarre story. You see, says the Midrash, Og was a giant. He was an awesome giant of epic proportions. It is true that the Torah itself, the Bible, does mention in one peculiar statement that we are talking about a unique individual. It mentions that in Rabat Ammon, we would know Rabat Ammon from today, it is a city in Jordan, not too far from here. In Rabat Ammon, says the Torah, there is what is called arso, loosely translated as a cradle. His cradle was made out of steel, and it was a 9-foot-long cradle. Imagine to yourself a cradle for a baby that needs to be 9 feet long. Well, the biblical verse for itself could be interpreted in many different ways. The word arso does not need to mean cradle. It could mean his bed. His bed was a long bed. So yes, he was a big guy. But perhaps, says the Midrash, perhaps we would like to say, no, we are going to examine this personality as someone that is truly a huge giant. How big, you will ask? Well, tells us the Midrash. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he knew that he had to confront Og, went and stood to battle against him. Moshe, tells the Midrash, was no less than 10 feet tall, and he grabbed a sword that was another 10 feet long. And he leaped high up into the air to swing his sword at Og, another 10 feet high up into the air. And as he swung the sword, he managed to hit the bottom of the ankle of Og. The ankle, 30 feet tall. Yes, the Midrash in a very colorful way describes to us how moments before Og, in his decision to annihilate the Jewish people, grabbed a massive mountain and ripped it out from its place, lifted it over his head, and was about to throw it onto the people to squash them in one strong, big blow. And God summoned ants to carve a hole through the mountain, and as his ankle was struck by Moshe, the mountain collapsed down onto his head. He fell down, broke his neck, and that was the end of Og. Cute, you must say. Quirky, strange. Why tell us such fabulous tales? Simple mathematical analysis would have led us to the conclusion that if Og's ankle was 30 feet tall, his height in total must have reached close to a mile. How could any living being be that tall? How is it possible to understand this Midrash literally? Obviously, it was not intended to be literal. In fact, Moshe, of course, was not 10 feet tall either, nor could he leap 10 feet into the air. So we need to look at this through another angle. And for that, we need to take a journey all the way to the earliest time of humanity and look for occurrences in which our sages deliberately inserted Og into the biblical story. The Torah, as I mentioned, makes no mention of this. But our sages deliberately insert Og throughout critical moments throughout the early development of our people. When Abraham finds out that his dear nephew Lot was taken into captivity after the wild world war that took place between the 4 and the 5 kings in the early days of Sefer Bereshit. And Avraham knew that he needed to go rescue his nephew that has been taken into captivity. The Torah tells us that he finds this out through a man that is called Hapalit. The word Hapalit merely means one that was ejected, one that escaped. Vayavo Hapalit. This Palit came to inform Avraham of the capture of his nephew. The Midrash there asks, who is this Palit? Where did he come from? Says the Midrash right away, this Palit is Og. Og, says the Midrash, he was not just ejected from this war. That's not where he truly escaped for. Where from? Where was he niflat from? Where was he a Palit? Says the Midrash, an amazing thing. This is Og, that was the survivor of the generation of the flood. Yes, indeed, the Midrash goes on to describe to us that even though the Torah explicitly says to us that only Noah, his wife, and his 3 children and their wives were survivors of the generation of the flood, there was one more. There was one more giant that hung on to the ark from the outside and grabbed on as the water rose and rose and rose and held on to the ark throughout the entire journey of the flood, and thus survives the experience. The Midrash doesn't leave it at there, and they say something very peculiar. They ask, well, how is it possible that Og could have survived the water of the flood? After all, the water was boiling hot. And they answer this is not a problem because around the ark the water was cool. In fact, the water was cold around the ark. Tremendous symbolic ideas being expressed here. Continues the Midrash and says that the eye of Og covered the window of the ark, thus closing the window for Noah to see anything but the eye of Og. Curious. The Midrash goes ahead and inserts Og once more at the moment that Yitzchak is born. The continuer, the heir to Abraham, the future promise of the Jewish people. Says the Midrash that when Og met with other leaders of that time, he said, oh, don't worry about Abraham and his crazy ideas. He's an old man, he will be gone soon, and with him will all of his crazy ideas be gone. After all, he never gave birth to a child, he has no heir. And when Yitzchak was born, and Abraham invited everybody to a great party, Og was there too. And the other leaders said to Og, well, you told us that Abraham will be gone? There will be no continuation? Says Og, what? This puny little kid? I will step on him or squash him with my thumb and it will be gone. At that moment, says the Midrash, Abraham roared in anger at Og and put him in his place. And Og, in a moment of fear, had his tooth fall out. And Abraham used that tooth as a comfortable bed for the remainder of his life. How strange. Our sages were not interested in telling us silly tales. They wanted to express pivotal ideas. The same Og appears once again when Yaakov comes down to Egypt and meets Paro for the first time and introduces his family. And he is there to tell Paro not to worry about the budding young family of Yaakov. They will soon be gone. And so on and so forth. He emerges once again to constantly try to say to the nations of the world, the Jewish people are no concern. They're no real worry. A thread is drawn throughout all of these ideas that might help us to understand why our sages went out of their way in so many different references to create this image of Og being an awesome giant. As if these stories are not enough, the Gemara tells us about Abba Hillel, a Amora, a Talmudic sage who was well known for telling us tales of great exaggerations, in which he says that once he was running through a field and he ran into a large structure that looked like a bone cavity. And he continued to run and run and run for nearly 300 feet until he got out from the other side, until he realized that this is one of Og's bones. Again, trying to describe this massive, huge size of epic proportion. I believe that our sages took Og as a symbol to what the Jewish people have to fear most. The purpose of Am Yisrael, our task in life, is to be a light unto the nations, is to look around us and care to everyone that is around us. In fact, the entire world, according to our philosophy, is built on the foundations of chesed, of caring and kindness and worrying about one another. Og, to me, represents the ultimate model of the anti-chesed in the world. He is the anti-chesed that stands tall and fights against any caring whatsoever. He wants each person to take care of himself. This imagery of Og holding on to the teva, looking, peering with one eye into the ark, as he sees Noah sitting comfortably with his family, while with his other eye he sees the utter destruction of humanity, must have led him with a deep impression. You see, our sages placed him in this mode in order to be able to project this idea that on one hand, Noah indeed only took care of himself, as a great contrast to Abraham 10 generations later, that spent his entire life trying to take care of others, trying to teach, trying to educate, trying to care for, and trying to bat even for the most wicked, in the case of the city of Sodom. Og objects to the idea of Abraham. This is the Og that when he finds out that Lot was taken into captivity, he runs to tell Abraham. He runs to tell Abraham because he knows that Abraham is crazy enough to try to save him. And he knows that this will be his doom. How could Abraham stand up to these warriors, these great four kings that created and masterminded a huge world war? In fact, he was wrong. Abraham defeated these kings. Abraham saved Lot because Abraham understood what it meant to care for others. And thus, throughout the development of the Jewish people, Og kept on calming the world down, saying, no, this influence of Am Yisrael that will unite people, that would free people, it won't be long-lived. It will disappear. And indeed, after 40 years of life in the desert, after wandering and wandering through the desert all by themselves, Moshe, as he was ready to confront this great Og, was very worried. He was worried indeed that the influence of Og, the philosophy of Og, would have clinged on to the Jewish people as they lived by the lonesome for all these years. Perhaps they too adopted this idea that all they need to do is care for themselves. And if they are to be successful in entering the land of Israel and fulfill their destiny, they need to be able to understand how important their role is, how they have to reach out and care for others. Immediately God calms him down and says to him, do not worry. Today you will defeat this Og. You will eradicate the anti-chesed forever out of this world. You will free Am Yisrael to stand tall, to stand bravely, and to conquer the land of Israel as they move on to fulfill their role in destiny. Today you will strike down this awesome giant. Yes, indeed, the inclination to do nothing for others, the inclination to worry only about yourself, was seen as a powerful force by our sages. It is a powerful source that could be a huge giant that always needs to be fought against courageously. But if we believe in our role, if we believe in our destiny, then we will always be able to fight and defeat the Ogs around us, no matter how great they seem, no matter how great they may present to be. Because our role throughout our history and our role in the future is to bring chesed into this world. And that will always be the guiding light for our people. Thank you very much.